So next up, we're going to do a panel discussion about emissions reduction and the carbon opportunity. This discussion will be moderated by Chip Comins, Chairman and CEO of AREI, and AREDAY with panelists Mike Hart and Klaus Lackner. Please welcome our next panel.
Thanks, Leilani, and thanks for remembering to thank our sponsors, without whose support none of this would be possible. We've all heard that before, but it's really true, and we really have to acknowledge the fact that the folks that that are willing to donate to the Institute and to the AREDAY are what allows this conversation to go forward. And so I want to get right into it here with Klaus Lackner, one of our esteemed colleagues, and you just heard, of course, from Mike Hart. And I'm just going to go right up to the 100,000-foot level for a minute here, and that is that at the 100,000-foot level, we have a big problem, and it's called this overabundance of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon, which is up there for 100 and some parts up to 1,000 years. Add to that methane, hydrates and cathrates and all of the other greenhouse gases, and we've got a serious situation, particularly in that for the last million years, we actually never exceeded 300 parts per million, and we kind of hung around the 280 parts per million and for 1 million years. But then since we hit oil in 1859, we have now increased it to, I believe, where we're stabilized today at around 402 parts per million, but I hear it's spiked up to 417 since we surpassed that point of hopefully no return. And so with the recent IPCC findings and the Paris agreements saying that 2 degrees centigrade was no longer tolerable or acceptable, and that we have to actually hold it to with 1.5, which we are on a very fast track to blow right through that, probably, I don't know, maybe in the next 10 years or less. I want to go right to Klaus initially, because Klaus has been working, he's one of the fathers of the removing CO2 from the atmosphere conversation, and we've been calling that air capture carbon negative. The IPCC has officially and formally recognized that we're going to have to do that in order to stabilize our atmosphere. So that's, 99% of the world's leading scientists agree to these findings. So if we're really faced with it literally extracting the carbon from the air, which we can't see, and then, as Graciela likes to say, and turning it into cash, which we can see, okay, putting the green in the green, let's just go there very quickly, Klaus, and tell us, can we do it?
I would think so. Otherwise, I wouldn't be pursuing it. I do want to make one point up front. You said it's 100 to 1,000 years. It's actually much longer. Half of the CO2 goes away very fast. The other half is with us for a very long time. Effectively, the warming we get from 1 ton of CO2 is with us for 1,000 years, and then it gradually goes away. So for all practical purposes, the message of this morning is absolutely right. What goes up does not come down. So we have to figure out how to balance things. And I want to put one number in your head as we discuss these things. 5,500. What I mean by this is 5,500 million tons of CO2, which is emitted in the US every year. So if we talk about markets for using the CO2 we can take back, we're talking about 8 million tons of what I would call merchant CO2, where we do everything, whether it's the kind of stuff which comes on a truck, where you actually pay somewhere between $50 and $300 a ton. So the typical price is between $100 and $150 for commercial CO2, which gives you a feeling there is a market, but that market is 8 million tons. If you look at the market for making fertilizer, urea, you're talking 40, 50 million tons. Enhanced oil recovery right now is consuming 40, 50 million tons. Compare that to the 5,500 I started the discussion with. So the question is, it doable? I believe that manufacturing can do an awful lot. Our goal is to demonstrate a device which can operate at the 1 ton a day level. You may say that's a horribly small thing, and it does fill up a trailer truck or a standard shipping container. So you could factory build them, put them out in the world where you need them, maybe in some place just one, because you just need 1 ton a day. In other places, you need thousands of them in one place in order to feed the CO2 you need for this particular application. And so then the question is, can you actually make a dent? And I did the back of the envelope on this and said, let me just, for the sake of argument, say, we want to be as big as current emissions. That's 36 gigatons, 36,000 tons, million tons a year. So the answer is, well, if you want to do that, then 1 ton a day devices, I seem to need 100 million of. Because 365, that's where the 300 days in the year. So if you work this out and they last 10 years, well, then you have to build 10 million a year. That sounds like a horribly large number, but let's compare it with things we routinely do. These things are a little heavier than a car, but they are much simpler in what they do. And so think of a car as a first order stand-in of a comparison. We build 80 million a year. Now, if you want to maintain a fleet of 100 million, and they last 10 years, I need to build 10 million a year compared to the 80 million. We have a fleet of about 1 billion cars on the planet. And they, by the way, found a place to park. So we can put up 100 million containers. And if you look at Shanghai Harbor, it processes 30 million containers that are full. So there's an industrial capacity behind Shanghai, which is big enough to fill that industrial capacity. We grew in car production from 70 million to 80 million, which is about what we are talking about between 2008 and 2014 on the world level scale. So my view is, if we have the political will, we have the technical wherewithal to get to that scale. We can do it. The question is, how do we get started? We have this very small market of merchant CO2, and by the way, you won't get all of it, because if you're right next to an ammonia plant, I can buy that CO2 for $50 a ton, and I don't think we will compete with this for a long time. On the other hand, in Phoenix, Arizona, in 2008, a ton of CO2 was retailing at $300 a ton, and that's because it had to come by truck from that ammonia plant in LA. Right? So the truck ride defines the cost. Right now, people at ASU pay about $600 a ton to feed algae CO2. We are in the process of using our CO2 to replace that. Those are small markets in which you can learn. You could look at EOR and say, well, then you put even more CO2 out. I'm not all that chagrined about it, because it's a place to learn, to drive the cost down, to make it better. But ultimately, you have to get to the really big markets. And I think the intermediate market, which doesn't yet exist, which I think is very worthwhile in this context, is let's create a circular carbon economy. You guys are making renewable energy. You give me electricity, you give me from photovoltaics, you give me electricity from wind and from hydropower. If I take that electricity when you have too much, and with windmills, you will always have that, and we are working with a group in Denmark who is actually doing this with wind. You can take that electricity and make hydrogen. I've heard about this many times. If you give me hydrogen and CO2, we have 100-year-old technologies which can convert this. It's your syngas. That is exactly what you are doing, right? Now that you have it, you can make methanol, ethanol, diesel, gasoline, dimethyl ether, whatever you think is the designer fuel of your choice. That has two benefits. One is you suddenly don't need petroleum. The other benefit, and it solves your problem of flying, as Hank put it yesterday, from flying from Hawaii to Iceland, because you can fly on jet fuel, which was made with wind energy or photovoltaic solar energy, and it thereby reduces CO2 emissions. And it solves a very big challenge to the renewable energy side, which is the intermittency. This becomes a consumer, a flexible consumer, which can turn on whenever nobody else is there, and turn off when the electricity is really needed, and in a pinch can give some of it back when you actually need it because you fall short. So I see this as the next big market. Beyond that, there's an even bigger market, and I hate to put it this way, because we started out saying whatever goes up won't come down. We have a waste disposal issue, and the easiest, and this is different from saying we have to reduce. And I give you a simple way of looking at it. If I were at home to dump my garbage in the street in front of the house, and you are my neighbors, you would rightly object. And you wouldn't take it for an answer if I said, I listened to your objections. I figured it all out, and guess what? I reduced my garbage dumping to the street by half. I'm really good at it, so please stop complaining. You would say, stop this immediately and figure out something better. We have 5,500 million tons a year in the US, and we can use an awful lot of it, but I doubt we will use all of it. And if we want to balance the books, whatever we didn't use or whatever we already put out has to be put somewhere. And so in that sense, we have to think of this as pollution. We have to stop dumping into the atmosphere, and that means to the extent it got into the atmosphere, we have to take it back out, and we have to safely dispose of it. This is beyond the circular economy. If we exceeded where we want to be by 100 ppm, we will have to find room for 1,500 gigatons of CO2 to put it somewhere. We can't make it work without sequestration. And in a way, it's extremely simple. You take a ton of fossil carbon out of the ground, you become responsible to put it back. It's that carbon credit card I talked about yesterday. We are continuously running up a debt, and eventually we have to pay it back. And the sooner we start, the better off we are.
Right, and we'll get to the ways that we can do that and to drive a circular economy in terms of a carbon tax and other ways to sequester this carbon. But before we get there, I want to move over to Mike for a minute, and as a follow-up, on your tech presentation on Sierra Energy. The garbage that we dump into our landfills each year, and you can remind us of what that number is responsible for an inordinate amount of methane, which is, as we know, 20 times stronger than CO2. It may be short-lived in the atmosphere, but it's still up there for 20 years or so.
84.
84 times. Okay, so that's a misnomer. So, and I don't know if there's the methane from the garbage is worse than the methane that's coming up out of the tundra. It's probably the same methane.
Same methane.
So when we talk about a gasification capturing the methane and then converting it into a useful fuel, and reducing the throughput, not 100%, but we're getting down to some pretty significant reductions, right? 80%, I think it is. Is that right, in terms of the methane that was being released to what? I'm just trying to get, I think that there's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot, and we have to look at it in terms of each of these different strategies must be deployed.
Sure. Let me start off by first saying, Klaus, I think that what you said is exactly correct, and that is, it's the sky dump is the problem. Nobody sees it. You throw gas away and it goes into the atmosphere, the big sky dump. Nobody cares because they don't see it. And it's only very recently people have been able to inventory it and realize just how bad it is and what the impacts are going to be.
A gallon of gasoline is 20 pounds.
Yeah, and so
think of sand coming out of the back of your tailpipe,
right,
and how you would feel about
just
all
trailing
that
it
sand
everywhere
along the freeway.
And so
right?
the sky dump is clearly the biggest problem we have. And the problem is that it's an ironic situation, and that is, Winston Churchill once said, America can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And the problem is that we actually are going to solve this problem. Technologically, CO2 is a fantastic fuel source. There's all kinds of things you can do with CO2. Unfortunately, the technologies are just at the very beginning right now. The uses for CO2 are just coming out. Just here at the conference, just in the last few days, I mean, making graphene, making carbon products, there's all kinds of things you can do with CO2 other than dumping it into the sky dump. The problem is the technologies aren't there yet at sufficient volume to take the CO2 that we're dumping every day into the atmosphere. Now, methane is the one that I feel like there's something we can do about immediately, because it's something that is being thrown away. Now, transportation, chasing cars and trying to figure out how to capture the CO2, that's a technological challenge I applaud you guys trying to take on, because I mean, that's fantastic. As we're able to recover CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, that's a big deal. But methane coming out of landfills, we know where this stuff is. Every day, the trucks are lining up, and they're dumping solids, which eventually turn into a gas. We're trying to prevent those solids from ever becoming a gas. In other words, ever becoming methane. We captured that first. The technologies exist right now to do that. The technologies are available today to prevent that from going into the atmosphere. Other technologies are coming on where people are coming up with ways of taking that CO2 that's already in the atmosphere and pulling it out of the sky dump and turning it into valuable products. So I think the opportunity is tremendous, and it's today. Your silver buckshot term is exactly correct. There are many solutions. There is absolutely no competition in this space. It's like a couple of medics on the field of Gettysburg saying, oh, there's a competition out there. It's like, no, we need absolutely everyone. Every technology should be deployed that can reduce the greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere.
And let me violently agree with you right now on that, because I don't see air capture as the solution for all the emissions. Quite the contrary. It's sort of silly to let things out which you can prevent from getting out in the first place. So what you are doing is absolutely right. And even if you have a power plant, a natural gas-fired power plant, if it runs, it should take care of its own CO2. This is not our job to take care of. We have to deal with the most difficult ones. And the nice thing about direct air capture is that at the end, it is the last option you always have. Because if you have an option which is even more expensive, why bother? You can get it always from the air. The air mixes so fast and so well that you can do that. But let me put the circular carbon economy as a challenge back to this group, to the renewable energy folks. Because I'm arguing, maybe we are at $100 a ton of CO2, when people were very critical, they said air capture will cost you $600 a ton. I was asked about this back then, how do I feel about it? I said, well, this particular process I would have thought was $1,000 a ton. And I said, it's a little bit like a bunch of fluid dynamicists studying, aerodynamicists studying penguins and conclude they can't fly. They are right. But on the other hand, you can't conclude from that that birds can't fly. And I would make another point. If you look at photovoltaics, you guys started out 100 times more expensive than you are today. Right? $600 a ton, if I were allowed to divide that by 100, the cost would be too small to meter. The reality is we probably get stuck somewhere between $100 and $30 a ton. But we are getting close to that 100 right now, because the processes we are looking at, Graciela was looking at, some other companies are looking at, are more efficient than the process the APS studied 5, 6 years ago. So we are well below that. $100 a ton would be 85 cents a gallon of gasoline to get the CO2 to make a gallon of gasoline. $30 a ton would be 25 cents. There are 40 kilowatt hours of chemical energy in that gallon of gasoline. If you are 50% efficient from your photovoltaic electricity to make that, you need 80 kilowatt hours. At 2 cents a kilowatt hour, that's still $1.60. That's where the challenge is. It's not in getting the CO2 back. And the technologies for taking that CO2 and that hydrogen and do something good with it have been around for 100 years. Fisher and Tropsch got their patent in 1925. So we can do all the bits and pieces, but we have to get this on our agenda. We need to want to do that. And I think there is such an advantage for intermittent energy and all of these things we can do with it that it's really worthwhile trying. The bits and pieces are lying there, and I think with air capture, we are bringing in the last missing link in there. And I don't think it's actually the hardest, it's the most unusual, because there was no need for this until recently. And people said it can't be done because they're thinking about flue gas scrubbers. This is different and has to be approached differently. And my analogy would be, people said heavier than air flight isn't feasible, and photovoltaics will always be too expensive. So air capture is quite doable. The CO2 just sticks to surfaces as the wind blows by, and we know what it costs to get it back off. I can give you the water bill and the electricity bill, and that adds up to less than $30, about $15 to $20 a ton. What makes it expensive is that this is an unproven technology and everything needs to be engineered and is still very expensive. So I don't think we are below $100 a ton right now, but we surely will get there, given a chance.
Right. Well, let's get right into the driver. I mean, all this is great. We know we can do it. We know we have the technology, but there's no driver for it. There's no market for it per se.
Small ones.
It's very small, and this needs to be deployed in a mass scale, as Lester Brown, an AREDAY alumni, has said many, many times. We have to go at wartime speed and scale. And really what we're up against is the analogy of FDR when he called the captains of industries into the Oval Office in 1941, and he said, I need cars, tanks, and ships, and he had his list, and they said, we can't do that because we're making cars, trucks, and buses. And they said, and he replied, no, gentlemen, you're not doing that anymore. There's a moratorium on that, and you can't buy in 1942 or 43 or 44, Ford or Chevy, because we weren't doing that. Now, that takes some serious leadership, and with this dysfunctional political structure that we're operating in today, it seems pretty unlikely, but still, it doesn't negate the physical reality of what's needed. So, when we combine market forces, I hope that, Mike, your technology is going to exceed beyond our wildest dreams. And Klaus, the fact that we can go to air capture, carbon negative, and that we have the ability to do that, but we need the drivers. So whether it's a carbon tax, which Americans can't seem to even say that word. I liked Rod's adding, cut to that, so the carbon tax cut. Oh, that sounds better, But what does that really mean? Does it mean that the corporations are going to do the right thing, with the tax cuts? How are we going to drive this this technology forward? So I want to just jump now to a new area, and you were touching on it a little bit, which is the recent breakthrough in all of our economic and perhaps hopefully ecological reality is the advent of the internet and the social networks that now occupy probably 80% of our lives, right? We're all staring at our iPhones and computers constantly. So that connectivity, the ability to get people connected on this issue. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about that platform as it applies to Sierra?
Yeah, I'd love to. For starters, one of the most powerful motivations for humanity is not fear, but it actually is greed. And I think the key for us to get our technology global is going to be greed. We need people to want to make money. And when I talk to developers all over the world, we have 11,000 people so far that have requested use of our technology all over the planet because they all want to make money. Yes, many of those people have altruistic bents, and that is they want to do something better for the environment, but a huge percentage of these people simply want to make a lot of money. And unfortunately, I'll take what I can get. If that's their motivation, let it be. But one of the ways of employing the social networks, and that is the way of taking that greed, some person wanting to make a profit off making the environment a better place. One way of doing that, we've created a web platform called techpipe.com. And TechPipe is set up specifically to aggregate communities. Right now, there are 3,100 counties in the United States. There are 50,000 globally. And what we want to do is we want to find one person in each of those communities, those 50,000 communities around the world, to become the exclusive distributor of our technology so they can make a ridiculous profit. We want them to make a lot of money. And what we're needing to do that is we want to activate social networks to find the right person to become that developer in their community. And we want to give them money for doing it. And so we're basically paying a bounty or a finder's fee to people to deploy their social networks to find the right person in their community to become the owner or the distributor of our technology there. Now, TechPipe is not just limited to our technology. We're making it available to anyone with an environmentally beneficial technology to use this same method, because exponential technologies are great, but there's no exponential form of distribution. And that's what we're hoping to do with TechPipe, is we want to be able to give people a way to reach globally, not in 10 years, but in 1 year. How do you have developers in every community on the planet trying to take a beneficial technology and make it happen profitably? So it's a combination of deploying social networks and profitability is what we see.
Fantastic. And as we were saying in the panel yesterday, how can we begin to popularize our own survival? And I think that it's going to come through these avenues of social networks and the internet and things that we haven't seen yet. Coming out of the whole X Prize and the Peter Diamandis thinking about how we're reforming and reframing, as we speak, especially through, and particularly through the millennials that were here on the stage earlier, and their thinking, and the urgency perhaps is upon them a little bit more than it is on us, right? So, well, Klaus, are you guys down at ASU in your work looking at those kinds of opportunities in terms of the air capture carbon negative conversation?
I'm very interested in it, and I observed right now that you here have occasionally on the sites, on the screens, we have a carbon offset for the conference. I think what our technology will lend itself to is the next step in that, where offsets to me have some creativity in explaining how bad the baseline is. I would like to have the opposite, is a certificate of carbon sequestration, where we say, look, we collected a ton of CO2 honestly, here it is, we did this with it. My goal is to make mineral carbonates out of it. I took olivine and turned it in magnesium carbonate and silica. Right. It's now gone, and I can hand you a certificate of sequestration. And my long-term goal would be that if you want to dig up a ton of carbon, you better have a ton of carbon's worth of carbon certificates, certificates of sequestration to match that. And if you get to that limit, then the world is in balance. And if you were to rip up those certificates and never let them see the light of day, you actually are carbon negative. So that is something where I could see the same kind of outreach, the crowdsourcing, the way of going back to individuals and say, force the issue this way, and then demand that if you want to pull coal out of the ground, if you want to pull natural gas out of the ground, you have to do this. In some ways, I think this problem is much easier than we make it, precisely because you need a balance, right? We shouldn't have cap and trade. It makes no sense to end up with a cap and trade where the cap is not zero, right? So therefore, we should say the system has to be balanced, and yes, we all have to sit down and figure out how to get from here to there. And maybe in the beginning, if you put out a ton of carbon, you only have to have 100 kilograms of certificates. This gradually ramps up. Or we find some other way of making the transition by having offsets and permits instead of it. But we need to find a way of doing this, and I think there the individual can help. Right.
Well, we just have an agreement coming out of Paris that's voluntary. Before that, we were operating under the Kyoto Protocol, and that was with VERs and CERs in Europe. Of course, the United States never ratified, so we were left with was the REC and the carbon offset market, which is very, very difficult to determine really what is happening there. We call those carbon indulgences. But the fact is now that this is a voluntary initiative, and the Kyoto Protocol is a thing of the past, and that there really is no driving, legal binding way to verify and certify these carbon reductions.
But that's where, again, a group like this could make all the difference. Because once you have them on a voluntary basis, you then can turn around and say they're actually real. They are not indulgences. Real stuff has been put away to make this happen. Now that we have succeeded in this, we can now go to the policymakers and say, we demand that becomes a requirement.
Sure, but they're going to require, anytime we've tried to do anything like this, the oil companies, the people that create the greatest amount of greenhouse gas and such, they're going to say there are no viable technologies that are available at scale sufficient to sequester enough carbon.
But that's where the volunteers come in. Right? Okay. The volunteers can show it. I can right now show you a thing running on the roof which is dealing with tens of grams a day. Right? Fine, it works. So I at least know the physics is right, the chemistry is right, but there's a far cry from being real.
I know, but that's what's killed ethanol. That ethanol has been an ongoing battle because people keep saying, ethanol is real. If we just have a consistent policy for 2 years in a row, the United States would be awash in the stuff. But the issue has been that the oil companies have very successfully argued over and over, well, it's not available. It's not available because you guys keep blocking it and filing lawsuits to prevent it.
But
if they took that same approach here,
the volunteers can prove it.
I'm 100% in favor of volunteers.
Right? But that's the role of the volunteer here. It's not to solve the problem. If you donate that carbon certificate, you didn't solve the world's problem. But what you did is you demonstrated, and you made the oil companies who say it can't be done an obvious liar.
I totally agree with you.
It's
just the argument of the sneaky thing they always pull is scale. They'll always say that, no, yes, you can prove it at this scale. Then they do some greenwashing, pretending they fund things they really don't. And then they say you can't do it at scale.
We have 1 billion cars on the road, and they are a third of the problem. not quite, but close.
Yeah.
Right? So you can see that lots of small machines can get to a very large scale if you let them grow. I think you can make the case which shows that this is nonsense, that you couldn't scale it up. There are plenty of examples. So think about how many PCs came in, how many cars came in between 1900 and 1925. How many airplanes came in between 1950 and 1965?
I agree, but even at an exponential scale, we're talking about a number of years. I completely agree with you, by the way. I'm just simply saying that
that is a challenge.
The industry standard response is going to be to sue, lobby, block, and say you can't do it.
Here is something
Okay, guys, hold on. You know what? This is an interesting conversation. However, we're running out of time, and I want to go to the audience. So I'm going to cut that one there. And I'd like to engage the audience. Obviously, this is one of the toughest panels we're going to have because there is no clear answers, just like there is no clear carbon or methane. You can't see it. And that goes to dumping into the commons. You know, the analogy, Klaus, that you made, great. You know, if you dump your garbage out your front door, your neighbors are going to get very angry very quickly. However, when we keep on dumping it out of our tailpipes and our stacks and nobody sees it, we can keep on going on and denying it until finally, like the frog in the slowly heating pot, we are, with the little X's on our eyes. So I think that this is a really good place to go to the audience. I'd love to engage the audience on this very, very difficult conversation about how we are going to deal with this invisible gas, this heat trapping blanket, that is, cooking our goose. So, do we have a question? We do, okay.
Yeah, I'm scaling it up. There's a similar technology, and we've got a subcontractor in League City that's builds steam reformation equipment. So, with your equipment, is that possible to job some of it out to scale?
So what's the question?
Just be able to scale it up.
For which one of us or
Your
both?
product.
Yeah, of course. Oh, absolutely. I mean, a typical blast furnace, which is what we're based on, is a blast furnace. Typical blast furnace could handle 10,000 tons of waste a day, and that's normally built. We just are very small because we're a tiny little company. We haven't got a whole bunch of money. So yeah, scaling up would be easy if there were people that had the manufacturing capability.
We've identified 10 subcontractors on the Texas coast. So, okay.
Fantastic.
Good.
Any other question?
Could I make one comment? You said that you were talking about gas and nobody can see and they don't regulate, things like that. Alessio Canyon in Los Angeles, where there was that giant methane leak, nobody could see it, but a lot of people got sick. But the most important thing wasn't the people who got sick as far as the company that owned it. It's the lawsuits they're going to face and the enormous amount of gas they lost and all the regulation they're going to face. People are realizing from a profit percentage, from a profit perspective, they have to change what they do to control methane. And so that's an example. I believe the right solution is profit because it is the most motivational thing in human history, unfortunately. It's what drives all these companies. I believe that regulation, taxes, things like that are all absolutely beneficial. If people can get them through, I'm in favor. But in the end, profit is what's going to make this work.
In your case, it actually works beautifully.
But it'll work in your case too. Think about how much carbon dioxide is actually worth. It's a significantly valuable commodity.
Not at 5,500 million tons a year. It's on the short level, yes, and that's where we can get
fuel,
to.
but you can make fuel with CO2, and that's one of the greatest things that people spend money on this planet.
Right.
If you can take CO2, break it down, and reform it, which a number of
And this is
technologies
what
are
I
pursuing.
suggested, right?
If you've got the technology to capture it, the market will exist when you have it at sufficient volume and a sufficient price. I believe that profitability is what's going to change the planet. If you show carbon dioxide is more valuable a commodity than it is to simply blowing it into the sky dump, people will be capturing it at every corner of this planet and using it.
Okay, well, that's the first time that I've heard that greed saves humanity, but maybe you're right. Richard, you have a question?
It does.
Is there any chance that your process may go into old landfills and recapture that land?
I've received probably already about 500 requests from communities. The United States used to have tens of thousands of landfills, and they were all unlined. And so the stuff was going into the streams, it's going into the soil. The EPA said, no, you have to have properly lined and covered landfills. When they said that, they sort of pushed dirt over their existing landfills and started trucking their garbage 100 miles away to large, very well-maintained and run landfills. There's 2,100 left. But that means there are tens of thousands of landfills dotting the United States. Every town has one somewhere. and it's contaminated. And what we can do is you can dig it up, you can pull the waste out and run it through our process, recycling 100% of the metal and capturing the energy that's in there. It's a huge amount of energy.
Well, New Jersey had a problem with its waste. They started barging it out into the ocean, and that had such a negative effect. They stopped. Then they started loading freight cars and taking the waste to Ohio. That's pretty expensive, I assume. So
the biggest problem with New Jersey is you don't want to dig up their landfills because God knows who you'll find in there. But, but truthfully, one of the biggest things that we were interested in, it was what actually got us started, was the Pacific Gyre, is we were looking for some way of taking all that waste, the dump that's in the ocean, and scooping it up. Now, talking to the leading people in the industry, they all shook their head and said, if you could figure out a way to make the communities along the Pacific Rim at least capture their waste and stop adding more, New Jersey included, of course, but as far as dumping more waste into the ocean, that's a huge step forward, just like we're talking about with the atmosphere. If we can stop dumping, then start working on the problem of what's already there. Can we harvest it? Can we turn it to something more valuable? We can, in the ocean.
I think we do need a push and a pull. And you have a good economic pull in many cases, but this problem is so large that I also want to have the push.
Totally agree.
Which says, we need a regulation which says, you're not allowed to dump. We have done this with garbage, we have done this with sewage, so we should be able to do it here too. And we just have to get that mindset that if it goes in the atmosphere, I like your term, sky dump. We're not supposed to do that. And I think we need to come to a societal agreement on that.
Totally agree.
Great. Well, it looks like we've run out of time, but and I'm not sure that we've come to any really distinct conclusions, except for that we know we have a problem and we know we have a solution. Let's implement.
Thank you very much. Thank you.